everyone, my name is Gwen. I am a software developer and I also run the YouTube channel and Twitch channel called Faraday Academy. And I am very excited to be able to come on Traversy Media's channel today for this project. Now specifically, I will be building an app with Gridsome, which is a static site generator for Vue.js, and a backend with Strapi. Feel free to leave any comments, questions, or feedback in the comments below. I hope you enjoy this project. This app is a virtual events platform inspired by current web apps like Eventbrite. It also filters in between tabs for different categories of events. All of the information for these events is stored inside of the Strapi API that we are going to build. And we pull that information into Gridsome and display it, and we can search by the title as well. By clicking on any one of these cards, we can see an individual event page for that event that is made with Gridsome Templates, and then we can go back to the home page. To build this API, I'm going to be using a CMS called Strapi. Now, like it says, Strapi is 100% written in JavaScript, and it's open source so you can customize it as much as you want to. However, since this tutorial focuses on Gridsome and we won't really be diving too deep into Strapi, we aren't going to be actually touching the code. We are just going to be setting up a Strapi server locally and using it as an API with a database in order to store and manage our events on the back end, and then we're going to hook Gridsome up to it on the front end. If you want a more in-depth tutorial on Strapi, then there is already a really good one on this channel, Traversy Media, so you can check that out after if you want. Now, the reason why I chose Strapi specifically is that unlike a lot of CMSs, with Strapi, it's really easy to create custom types. For example, instead of blog posts, I could create events and then update those events inside of the CMS admin interface. And then I can pull all those events to my front end with a simple API request. And you'll see what I mean with setting up custom types once we start setting up Strapi. So I'm going to go ahead to get started and then scroll down here to install Strapi. Instead of yarn, I'm going to use npx, so I don't have to globally install anything here. I'll just copy this command. And now I'm in an empty folder on my computer where I want to put both my Strapi API and my Gridsome frontend later. So I'm going to paste that create Strapi app command. It's called my project. I'm going to call it by the app name, so I'll call it Events API. And now it set up my Strapi application and it also ran it at the same time. So it's available at localhost port 1337/admin. And if I come to the admin page, there's a form for me to set up my root admin user. I'm going to call it Gwen F. Just give it any old password. And for the email, I don't need a real email. So I'm going to do gwen@example.com. Of course, I don't want updates. And click ready to start. You've already seen a small demo of the app. The two types of content that we need to retrieve from the API are events, and then we need to categorize those events. So we need a category related to the events. So I'm going to create an events content type and call it event. Click continue. And now I can add fields to the event. So I'm just going to add these real quick. The first one is a text field called title. It always gives you some more options down here. This will be short text, which is good because I want to be able to search on this field later. And I'm going to click add another field. Now I'll choose text again, and this time it will be called description for the description of the event. Long text, click add another event. So I could have actually done the description as rich text, but I don't want to get too fancy with it, so I'm just leaving it as is. And now I need the date and time of the event. So I'm just going to call this date, and I'll choose date time here. Add another field. I need a number field for the duration of the event. The number format here is going to be an integer. Or actually, I'll choose decimal because the event might be something like 1.5 hours. So I'll pick this one, add another field. I'm going to skip category for now because I'm going to make categories later. And then the last field will be another integer field, or rather a decimal field, which will be price. Of course, there's no location for these events because they're all virtual. So those are all the fields I want now. Click Save, and I'm going to save the event type. And now I have created an event type. You can think of this kind of like a schema for a table in the database. Now, by default, Strapi uses SQLite, which is fine for what I'm doing, but it's pretty flexible in letting you use Mongo or Postgres or really whatever kind of database you want to use. Also notice that I gave this a singular name here, but when I look at the table, it's actually plural here, events, which is pretty similar to what you'd see in other CMS admin interfaces like Django. So I'm going to click on events, and you can see there's an empty table. Now I could add a new event, but actually first I forgot to come and add a new collection type for categories. So I'm going to create it here with the category display name, click continue. And the first field I want here is just text. This will be the name field, which will be short text, just the name of the category, like music or art. And I'm going to add one more field, and now this field is going to be a relation type. Click on that. And now category is going to have a many-to-many relation with the other type that I've created, which is event. So events and categories are now related. An event can have many categories, and a category can have many events associated with it. So I will finish that. And now you can see I have this category schema, and then I have a categories collection over here. First, I'm going to add some categories here. So I'm going to add a category and just call this music. I don't have any events to associate with it yet, so I'm just going to save it. And then I'll add another category, and I'm going to call this coding, so people can host coding events. Save that. All right, so now I have two categories here, and I'll go to events, and I can add a new event here, and I'm going to call this code and coffee. Description, we get together and chat about code. Okay, I'll pick a date, which is just going to be tomorrow. The time is fine. Duration, I'll say 2 hours. And the price is free, so 0. All right, and now I can come down here and relate a category to it. So the category will be coding, and everything looks good. I'll save it. So now I have this one event, and I also have some categories. So I want to make an API call and retrieve my events, or one event in this case. So I can actually do this by typing in localhost port 1337/events. And now I have hit the events API, but it's telling me that it is forbidden. And that's because I have to grant access to that API. So really quickly, I'm going to come down here to roles and permissions, and I'm going to come to public. And since this is a tutorial API, I am actually going to set all of these to public, so I can do any of these operations from any application. And I'm also going to be able to make GET requests on category, and I'll basically be able to do any kind of CRUD operation on events. And I'll save that. And now if I come back to my browser and refresh this page, I can see that I was able to retrieve my event. And now /events would be a list of all of the events in the database. And then I could do /events/1, and this would be only that one event. And you can see it changed from an array of objects to just one object. So I'll be able to access this API from the front end. And now off camera, I'm going to add more events to the database and update them a little. But that's basically how it's going to work. And now we'll move on to actually creating the front end in Gridsome. So what is Gridsome? It's basically a Vue.js framework for building statically generated websites and apps that are fast by default. Now, what does it mean, fast by default? So Gridsome provides you with a number of optimizations to make the user experience really fluid, like prefetching. For example, when a user navigates to a page with a link on it, then Gridsome will go ahead and prefetch static content for the next page, just in case that user clicks on the link. That way it will be a seamless transition when the user is navigating page to page. It is also set up as a progressive web application by default, so this works even if the user is offline. They also provide you with a special image tag, which basically loads a really low quality of all images on the page at first, and then it will fetch the high quality image for any images that are currently in the user's view. So if you had a blog with a whole bunch of posts that each have their own image, as the user is scrolling through your blog listing page, the high quality versions of all of those images will load as the user scrolls. This is a nice user experience because the content isn't jumping all over the page as images are loading, and the initial load can also be much faster. Another benefit of Gridsome is that it's SEO friendly. Many single-page applications and single-page application frameworks struggle with SEO because it's more difficult for things like search engine bots to crawl the page and index it for a search engine. Well, Gridsome takes care of that because it renders all of the static content up front so bots can crawl just fine, and then it loads the Vue.js JavaScript so it can still work like a regular SPA. One other thing that Gridsome provides is a simplified way of building Vue applications. Gridsome abstracts away some of the boilerplate that you would normally be coding with a regular Vue application. For example, it handles routing automatically based off of your file names. There is also no need for Vuex because it has a GraphQL data layer that simplifies and pools API calls all in one place. Now, the data doesn't have to be just API calls. It can also be local files, Markdown, and it integrates with lots of Jamstack services. So there are a few frequently asked questions about Gridsome that I just want to cover real quick. And I first want to mention that as a former Gatsby user, now that I use Gridsome, they both feel almost identical to me. In fact, the Gridsome team says that the project is heavily inspired by Gatsby, which, if you don't know, is a React static site generator that works like Gridsome using GraphQL and the same kind of optimizations and Jamstack integrations. So the difference is basically Gridsome is for Vue.js and Gatsby is for React. Now, some people ask why they don't see any big companies using Gridsome, and I think there are a couple reasons for that. For one, it's a relatively new project. It hasn't even hit version 1 yet, although there has been quite a bit of active development on it, and they have a roadmap where they're working towards that version 1 goal. Also, Gridsome is optimized for small or maybe medium-sized projects. I can't really see it being used on a very large project. Some of the best examples for use cases of Gridsome are blog pages and portfolio pages, store websites, local websites, informational websites, I don't think it would work very well as a robust application like Reddit or something like that. Another common question that people have is, what is the difference between Nuxt and Gridsome? So Nuxt is a Vue.js framework where you can build all different types of applications, but it's mainly used for server-side rendering, although you can use it to build single-page applications or as a static site generator like Gridsome. Now, at first glance, they look extremely similar. Even their abstraction of route handling is virtually identical. The two projects, what they cater to, and especially the development experience. So Gridsome was built with Jamstack applications in mind, and the GraphQL data layer and how it's set up is unique to Gridsome. With Nuxt, you can absolutely use GraphQL or REST or whatever you want, but you are either going to be doing it from the component just like you would in a regular Vue.js application or from Vuex, which is automatically set up for you in Nuxt. Now, Gridsome doesn't use Vuex because of that GraphQL data layer. So those are some of the differences. If you want a short and sweet version, Nuxt is better for larger and more robust applications, and Gridsome would be better if you're building a Jamstack project or if you want to spin up a simple static site quickly. Now let's talk about installing and setting up Gridsome. The first thing it prompts you to do is to install the Gridsome CLI tool, and instead of installing it globally, you can definitely use npx. It doesn't matter, but I'm going to copy this command, and I'm going to make sure that Gridsome is installed. Now that I have the Gridsome CLI installed, I can use the Gridsome command from my terminal and create a new Gridsome application. And I'm going to call this, the name of my app is Events, and then I'll call it Front for front end. Okay, and now if I check out what's in this directory, I have the Events API, which is the Strapi app, and Events Front, which is the Gridsome application. So I'm going to move into the Gridsome application folder, and before I run the Gridsome development server, I'm going to open the code up in VS Code. And let's take a look at the files we receive out of the box. So it comes with a package.json file and these 3 scripts, so you can build for production to generate all of your static files so you can upload them to the server. Develop is the command that you run to run the Gridsome development server as you are building the application locally. And the explore command is what you use to start a GraphQL playground. You can see here there is only one dependency, Gridsome, and we'll be adding more as we install Gridsome plugins and a few other things like a UI component design library. Now, there are 2 Gridsome specific files here. First, the Gridsome config will just contain any plugins that we add and the configuration for those plugins. The Gridsome server.js file is an abstraction that lets us interact with the Gridsome server. We get access to the API here with lots of different methods that we can use for that. And this is also the file where we will be pulling in all of our external data, such as from our Strapi API. The static folder is just like any other Vue.js static folder. It's for files that don't need to be processed by any build tools. They are just copied directly into the dist folder with the rest of the statically generated content. So the example they give here is a robots.txt file. And now for the actual Gridsome application code. So if you start a regular Vue.js application, you always notice a main.js file and an app.js file. Well, by default, Gridsome abstracts the app.js file away from you, and you can add it here only if you want something custom. The main.js file is a little bit different as well. Instead of exporting a Vue.js application, it exports a function where you pass in Vue, and you can set different options and things from inside of this function such as registering global components like this layout component. And then just briefly what all these folders are for. Pages are for each view of your application. For example, the main index page, about page, contact page, etc. You'll have a page for each of those inside of pages. Components are for anything that you want to import and display on a page. And this is no different than any other Vue.js application. You can create as many components as you want to break apart or reuse code and then import them into your pages. Layouts here, and we will see this in the browser in a second. It's basically a way to define layouts for different pages. If you have groups of pages where you want the same navbar at the top, the same sidebar, some of the same features, then you can define a layout component. And it always comes with this default layout, which you saw was registered in the main.js file. And then pages are basically displayed inside of this layout component in the slot tag. Templates are a little bit more advanced. They're basically for GraphQL collections, and the naming of the templates are important. They have to match the GraphQL collection. We'll talk about those a little bit later because it's hard to explain what they are without showing an example. Let's run the app from the terminal and see what it looks like. So I can use Gridsome develop for that to run the development server. Or as you saw, we have an npm script, so I can use npm run develop. And that basically runs the Gridsome develop command, and it's ready to view on port 8080. This is the default site that Gridsome provides with the home page and the about page. And I'm actually going to bring the address bar into the view so you can see that it's actually routing. So you can see just the home page and also the about page at /about. Now, if you look in the code here, you'll notice there is no Vue router. There's no router file where you're defining routes for pages. And that's because Gridsome takes every single page or folder in the pages directory and creates a route for each one. Of course, index is a special name, so that's just the home route. And then about or any other name uses /name, so that's why we have the /about route. One more thing to cover before we jump into building this application, and that is GraphQL. Gridsome has a GraphQL data layer where all of your data sources that are defined in that Gridsome server file are pooled into a GraphQL schema, and then you're able to query that schema in your components. Now, you don't really have to know GraphQL before watching this tutorial, as we're going to go over some of it as we go along, and you'll see how to explore GraphQL and also make your own queries. If you haven't worked with GraphQL before, the basic premise of GraphQL is that you can query only for the data you want, and it gives you a single endpoint to query all data. So it's not like a RESTful API where you have /users, /event, /tags, and so many other endpoints, and you have to query all of the different ones. In GraphQL, you just have one endpoint to query. Now, normally in an application, you would need to define a GraphQL schema for the structure of the data, but with Gridsome, it really handles all of that for us. And even though we haven't set up any data at all with GraphQL, there is already a schema set up for us that is available to query out of the box, as you can see it doing in this component. So normally in a Vue application, you have this template tag, you have a script tag, and then you have the style tag. Well, you still have all of those three tags to use in Gridsome, just like you were programming a normal Vue.js application, but you have more tags in Gridsome, which are your query tags. So you have like static query and page query where you can query this GraphQL data. But what does it mean to query for metadata site name? So actually Gridsome sets up a tool for us to be able to try out and inspect queries. So I'm actually going to copy this query here. So I'm going to go to the browser and go to localhost 8080 / and then 3 underscores, so triple underscore Explore. And this is the GraphQL Explorer that it provides. A GraphQL Explorer is not actually unique to Gridsome. You'll pretty much always have an Explorer like this, but it is a nice feature that it sets it up for you out of the box and gives you an endpoint to access it. And if you forget what that endpoint is, you can always look at your development server because it shows you the GraphQL Explorer right here. First thing I'm going to do is to paste in my query on the left over here. Let me zoom in on this. And this is the same query that that component was making, querying for a site name inside of the metadata object. I'll hit run, and you can see that the site name that I requested was returned to me. Now, where did this site name come from? It came from this Gridsome config file. So if I change the name here to events, I can now query again. And I actually had to restart my server for the change to show up. I can see that my site name has changed. Now, what else can I query for? Actually, by clicking on this schema button over on the right, the schema window pops up where I can explore the schema, and I can see that I was querying for metadata, which is this type, so type metadata, and these are all the attributes on metadata that I can query for. So for example, I could query for site description and also site URL. And you can see that when I'm typing, it automatically tries to complete the words as I'm typing them. Let me close schema and let me run this. And you can see that I got empty strings for site description and for site URL there. Well, to fix that, I could just add a site description here, and I'll say post or find online events. I'll restart my server and I'll rerun this query, and now you can see that my site description has shown up. If I look in the app, you can see that now it shows events here, and that is because my layout component is querying for site name, and then it displays site name here. Now it is $static here, and that comes from the static query tag, and then .metadata is the name of the query, and then site name is the attribute name that we queried for. Now I could add site description since I added a description in the Gridsome config. Let me add that here, site description, and then I'll go up here right below the header, and I'm going to put a paragraph tag with the double curly braces, and then I'll do $static dot metadata dot site description. And now if I look in the browser, you can see that right below the header it shows my site description. And even if I navigate to about, it's still there because the slot where the pages display is right below that paragraph tag that I added. That is a basic overview of how querying works inside of Gridsome. So the last piece of setup here is to set up a design framework that I'm going to be used called Vuetify. It's probably the most popular design framework and UI component framework for Vue.js, and I definitely use it a lot in my projects because there are just so many features, so many components provided by this framework. So to install this with Gridsome, I'm just going to search through the docs, and they have a section for using CSS and design libraries in Gridsome. So I'm going to scroll down here. It shows you how to set up Sass if you want Sass, and Vuetify. So Vuetify has several steps to set it up with Gridsome, and I'm going to go through these one at a time. Now, if you set up Vuetify in a regular Vue.js application, then the Vuetify docs will recommend that you install it using a Vue CLI plugin, but it won't work if you have Gridsome, so you'll have to manually install it with npm, but it's still pretty easy to set up. So I'm gonna copy this npm install, and I'll stop my server, npm install Vuetify. And now that it's installed, it's telling me to register the Vuetify plugin, and I also need to set up the Vuetify CSS, as well as the icons, which I'm just going to use the standard material design icons for this. And right now it's differentiating between Vuetify version 1.5 and how to set that up, and Vuetify version 2.0. And I'm going to be using 2.0 here. And I basically need to copy all of this and put it into my main.js file. So I'll go in source, go to main.js. And if I paste this, there will be some duplicate code. You can see it gave me the initial default layout component that I'm registering globally. And that's pretty much all my exported function was doing up here. Or that is all it was doing, so I'm going to get rid of that. And then default layout is being imported by the code that I copied, so I'm going to get rid of that too. And you can see now I'm importing Vuetify. Now I'm importing the CSS as well, so I get the styles. And then I'm using this CDN for material design icons, and I'm pulling those in. And I'm going to have to get rid of these 3 dots. That's not correct syntax. I'm not setting any options right now, but I'll leave the options in case I want it later. And now it says there is one more thing that I need to do in order to build my application with Vuetify, and that is some Webpack config. And for that, I need to install a plugin. So I'm going to save this or copy this, and go to my terminal, and I will install that plugin. Okay, so that installed, and now it's saying that I should modify my gridsome.server.js file to include the Webpack node externals package and whitelist Vuetify. So let me copy this, and I will go to my server.js file. Now I know I said before that the plugins will go in gridsome.config, but these are actually Gridsome plugins and not a package for Webpack. So I can put those in my server config here. Okay, now I added my API.chain Webpack to whitelist Vuetify. So let me come and run my server again, npm run develop, and now back in my application, I'm refreshing it. And you can see it definitely did something to the application. And now the new layout is actually because Vuetify changed some things, and I have also not properly set up Vuetify in my components yet. So let me go and do that really quickly. I'll come into layouts, and so my main layout, I need to put a Vuetify wrapper around here in order to use Vuetify properly. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of any styling that this application already has. And I'll also replace this div tag now with the Vuetify wrapper tag that's required for my application, which is vapp. So now everything on my page is wrapped in a vapp container. This header is my navbar, which I will change in just a minute over to being a Vuetify navbar, or rather called an app bar in Vuetify. But this slot I want to wrap in a Vuetify content tag, which is now called, this was recently renamed to vmain. Let's see if that changed anything in our application. And you can see now everything is stacked, and that is because of Vuetify's Flexbox, or that it uses Flexbox. And we're going to update this app to look much nicer anyway. And now back in my component, I am going to delete the whole header, and I'll also delete that description that I added. Now that I've removed the top navigation from the app, I'm going to go and find a Vuetify alternative. In Vuetify, the top nav bar is this component V app bar. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but if you want to know more about Vuetify's app bar options, then their docs are really nice where they give you these interactive playground examples so you can see all of the different features. Now, one thing a lot of people have questions about on this component in particular that I just want to mention is that there is this V app bar and then there is also a V toolbar. And when you look at it, they look almost identical where you can put a title, a draw menu, icons, all of this stuff. So what's the difference? Basically, a toolbar is something you could put anywhere in an application. You could use it for a markdown editor as a toolbar over a map or anywhere else. And the app bar is specifically designed to be the main navigation for your website or app. And so there are a few extra features in V app bar like scroll animations. So you can hide on scroll, inverted scroll, all these other things that aren't available in V toolbar. So we will be using the V app bar component for this. So above the main content, I'm going to add this V app bar component. And I'm just going to close it for right now. And I'll add a title inside as well. Now in Vuetify, you have nested components for a lot of the components. So basically components that go inside of components. So inside of the V app bar component, I can have a V toolbar title to put basically the brand or the title in a nav bar. Now the reason why it's called toolbar title instead of app bar title is because, like I mentioned before, these are two very similar components. While app bar is built on top of toolbar, so all of the nested components for toolbar also work inside of app bar. So I'll give it the name events and then close that tag. And you can see it added this rather large app bar at the top. So to style it, we're not going to use it how it is out of the box, but there's so many props that we can pass into this component. And for our purposes and for a general top navigation, there's just one prop that we need, and that is the app prop. So the app prop does a couple things, including adding a fixed style to the toolbar, so it'll stay there no matter how far down you scroll. But it also adds the fixed property while still keeping the other content below it on the page while the app bar is at the top, or while you are scrolled all the way to the top of the page. So let's see this. And now you can see that it's a more reasonable size, but all of the content is still pushed below it. And the position is now fixed, so as we scroll, the app bar will always stay there. Okay, so now I'm going to add the button, the create event button. So I'm going to come below the title, add a VBTN, and I just want this to be a regular button for right now. Again, there's a lot of button props that I can use, but I'll just keep it plain with the default material styling, create event, close that. Now the button is kind of on top of the logo here, and I actually want to bring the button all the way over to the right side of the navbar. And there's a shortcut for how I can do this and arrange things on the page in Vuetify. I could absolutely use something like Flexbox classes, but instead I'm going to use a special Vuetify component called VSpacer. And now you can see the button is all the way over to the right here. And that's because VSpacer, when it's put in the middle of two other components, it acts as if you put the justify content space between property on the parent. So basically it pushes component 1 and component 2 as far away from each other as is possible in the layout. And the last thing I need to add to this nav bar is actually the search box, which I want to put on this side over here next to the title. So in the Vuetify docs, I'm going to search for a text field. So there are lots of different options that I can use for the text field here. And just copy a regular text field. And I'll paste it in here. A little bit of cleanup first. I'm also going to get rid of the label here. And unlike the button, if I go to the browser and see the text field, you'll notice that it's not aligned really well by default. It doesn't look really nice. So there's several props that I need to use here to make it align in the nav menu. So I'm going to update this placeholder to say search. And I want to give this just a little bit of space away from the logo so they're not brushing up against each other. So I'm actually going to add a built-in Vuetify class here on this text field of margin left of 8. And since these are in 4 pixel increments for Vuetify, so that's 32 pixels, that should be a pretty nice margin. I also want this to have a border around it, not just a single line underneath the text. So I'm going to give this a prop of outlined and then also rounded, so the corners aren't squared. That looks much better, but it's still way too tall and it's not vertically centered at all. Fortunately, there are a few props that I can use to easily fix that. First, I'm going to make this a bit shorter vertically. So I'm going to give it the dense prop and then hide details and see how that looks. And I think that actually looks pretty good. Now I just need to shorten it or make the width smaller and add a search icon. So I'm just going to add a quick style tag to set a max width for this element. And I'm going to set it at 350 pixels. That looks pretty good. Now if I go back to the Vuetify docs, I can see some examples of icon usage. So there are different ways to append or prepend icons. And let me go to an outlined example. So you can put it before or after the search box, but I want it inside of the search box. So I'm going to do prepend inner or even try append to the end of the search box and see how those look. And if I look at the code here, I can see that the props I passed denote where to put the icon, so prepend inner icon, etc. Give it some space here. Prepend inner icon. The name of the icon I want is one of the material design icons that I already set up when I set up Vuetify. I'm going to do MDI for material design icons dash magnify. Save that. And there it is, a search box with the search icon at the beginning. And I think that looks pretty good for now. Next thing, I need to get rid of these boilerplate components and add the tabs to the interface. Here I'm going to use the vtabs Vuetify component, and you can see it's just basic tabs that switch with an underline. So I'm going to come here and copy some basic tabs. And now in my code, I emptied out the index.vue file, and I'm just going to paste those tabs in here. And in my browser, you can see I have tabs now. Now let me just do a little bit of layout cleanup here. So I'm going to add a container and a row like I have on the other pages. And give this some offset. Okay, I accidentally did 6. I changed this to 3. And that should be in the middle now. So now I need a way to capture what current tab I'm on. And I think I do that through vModel here. Let me just check. So here is a playground example where it shows switching tabs. And if I look in the code, so this models to tab, and that starts off as null, so it'll just default to the first tab. And I can see also here, I might want grow to stretch my tabs out and fill the width of the page. And I can also use some of these other things if I wanted them centered to make it easy to do that. But I think I'm going to try grow for now. So back in my code, I'm going to come to tabs and zoom in a little bit here. And I will do vModel and just model to a tab variable, just like it showed in the docs. And then I'll also set the grow prop there. And now come down and add a data method. Return an object, and I'm going to set tab equal to 0, which should be the first tab. Alright, so here are the tabs now. And if I look in my Vue.js DevTools, I can see that tab is 0, and now tab is 1, tab is 2, etc. Okay, so in a minute I want to watch for that tab change, but first really quickly I'm going to set up some cards to display below the tabs. So I'm going to come in here in Vuetify and look for cards and grab this card because it has an image and some text and even some buttons, so that's the exact layout that I want. And I'll just copy this, card, and I'm going to come below my tabs and then just paste in that card. Okay, and I'm going to leave most of this as a placeholder. I just want to remove the text that's in front of the image, and then I'll make this self-closing. Okay, it shows a basic card below the tabs, and I'm going to be using this to set up a watch function and change some of this data. So in my options object down here, I am going to add a watch object where I'm going to watch for the current changes of this tab variable in data. So I need to call my watch object the same thing here. I'm going to call it tab, and then in the method I get the value passed in. So I can take the value, and every time tab changes, it's going to call this method because it's watching for changes on that tab variable. And with a watcher, I can call other methods from inside here. So I can say if tab equals 0, then I'm going to say show all events. And that's a method that I'm going to make. Actually, it has to be this dot show all events. And for right now, I'm just going to put one else here and say this dot show events by type. And now I'll come down here to methods, create the methods object. And I'm going to create those two functions. So show all events as a function, and then show events by type. And let me see if this is working. I'm just going to console.log here. And the same thing here. Okay, it says tab is not defined, and that's true. It needs to be this dot tab. So if I come back here, it shows all, and then, oh right, it is an empty string. I was gonna say type here. So the methods in Watcher are working, that's great. Now I need to query here for the GraphQL data on the backend so that I can show the data as cards in this application. So to set that up, I'm going to come down to the Gridsome server.js file, And if I look inside the Gridsome docs, I can see there are examples for how to get data from various sources in my application. Like if I wanted to pull in Markdown files or Google Doc files. But I'm going to be importing from that Strapi API that I created. And to do that, I need to make a regular API call. So I'm going to copy this API.loadSource method that Gridsome gives me. And then first I'm going to stop my server and then install Axios. While that's installing, I'm going to come here, and I don't need these empty methods, going to delete those and paste in this load source method. And then at the top, I do need to import Axios. And to do that, I need to use the require syntax. So I'll say const Axios equals require Axios. Okay, and now I'm going to point this API call to my actual Strapi API that's running. So that's on localhost 1337. And then the specific call that I want to make is to the events endpoint. So I can get all events back from that. And that's going to come back as a big response object. And then the data is actually going to be on response.data. So I can go ahead and pull data out of the response. Now let me rerun my server really quick. Run develop. Okay, I'm getting an error here, and let me see. Okay, so the problem here was because I accidentally used HTTPS instead of HTTP. So now that I changed it to HTTP for localhost, everything works just fine. So in my GraphQL schema, you can see here that there are types that I can query. So for example, the type that we saw earlier was the type metadata. And on that type, I can get different information like site name, site description. And so here I'm going to be doing the same thing, only I'm going to have a type of events, and then I'm going to loop through those events and basically add nodes. So this is almost like array.push. So this collection I'm creating, you can think of it like an array in GraphQL, and then I add nodes, which adds each object of data that I have. So I'm going to loop through data, and actually just as a matter of preference, I'm going to set the type to be singular, and then I'm going to loop through event of data, because data is the array of events that I'm getting back. And then I do collection.addNode. So if you look at the data that I'm getting back, there are a lot of different pieces of information here, and I definitely don't need all of them. So I'm just going to take out the ones that I need specifically, which will be all of these: price, duration, date, description. Title is required by GraphQL, as is ID, and I can add whatever custom fields I want. For an image, these are kind of deeply nested, but I'm also going to grab the thumbnail via just the URL, and then I'll grab probably a medium image via the URL as well. So I already have ID and title. And that should be all of the information that I need. So whenever I update that server.js file, I need to restart my Gridsome server. So if I look at my GraphQL playground, I can see that I have this new event type. This is the event type that I just added. And I have ID, title, description, price, everything that I added, including the image. So let's write a GraphQL query for events here to test it out. And to get the actual data from events, or from the API that we've already pulled into our app, I can use the all event query, which basically lets me query all of the items that I have of type event. And now these next two terms are specific to GraphQL. So edges, you can think of this as the array of events, and then node is each individual event. And now I can query for any properties on event that I want. I can see from the schema I have ID, title, description. So let me just start with ID and title. So now if I come and hit the play button, and now you can see I got an array of all of my nodes here. Now you might be wondering why I couldn't just query all events and then just get all my events back. Why do I need edges? And that's actually because in GraphQL I have other metadata on all event that I can ask for, like page info and total count. Oh right, I need subfields here, and I can use this, let's just say is last. And this is pretty much useless information for this API, but I can get back the total count of items here. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. And now in my node, I want to get the rest of the information because I'm going to copy paste this query into my application. And that's all of the information that I have. So I'm going to copy this query and I'm going to add it to my index page. So it should be below template and above script. And I'm going to add a page query tag and paste in the query. Okay, and the only change I want to make here is give a name to this query. And so this event's name here is actually what I'm going to use in my component to loop through the events. So let's look at that. Now my loop I actually want to be in my card here. And I'm actually going to get rid of this card that centers it, or that class that centers the card. And I'm going to change this to 300 wide. And now above that, I'm going to add a v-for loop to loop through all of those events and display them as cards. For edge in, and now again, because I used page query here, I have access to $page here, and then .events, .edges. And of course I'll need a key here since I'm looping, so I'll use a unique key, just the ID of the node. So ID. Okay, and now let me put the data from the event inside of the card so we can see it show up on the page. So I'm going to make this image dynamic instead of having a hard-coded URL. Now these event URLs are only partial URLs, so I'm going to have to prepend the server and port. So let me add a variable in here, so it'll be edge.node.thumbnail. Okay, and then below the thumbnail, I do want the title, vcard title, and this will be edge.node.title. title, the card title. The subtitle is going to be the date. So that will be edge.node.date. And now I don't think I'm going to have any text here, so I'm going to get rid of this. So I'll look at the buttons in a second. Okay, cool. It is in fact looping through all of my cards. Now I think it's just not wide enough. I'm also zoomed in here. So I have to make sure that these are wrapping in rows, update the buttons, and also update the time here, but everything else looks good. Alright, so on this card I am going to add a class, and I'm going to give it a margin top of 5, since all of the cards are pushed up against each other and the top card is actually up against the tabs. And now for the buttons, so I'm going to get rid of the second button here. And with this one, I'm just going to have a more info button, so you can see more info about the event. And then I want to display these cards in a row. So I'm going to need to put all of the cards in the same container. And that container is actually going to be a vRow, which by default gives me the display property of flex. Okay, cool. So it is wrapping for me. That's great. Now I do want to space these cards out so they're not right on top of each other. So for row, I am going to set another flex property. And since rows are already display flex, I'm just going to add justify, and I believe it's space around. And these are all styling classes that Vuetify gives me. And yeah, that looks good. The only other thing I'm going to change is I want these cards to all be the same width. So instead of max width, I'm just going to set a width. Looks really good. So in the Strapi API, I have two categories here. I have music and coding. And I want to use the tabs to filter between all events, just one type of event, or the other type of event. And we already set up watch for this a minute ago. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is hook up these show all events and show events by type, these two methods that are called from my watch function. So just like I have up here, I have access to page.events.edges. I also have access to it inside of my Vue.js options here. So what I'm going to do is inside of data, I need to have a separate events array that will display the events however I'm filtering them. Now, I can't just do this $pages here because when the Vue.js instance is looking for data, the GraphQL query hasn't injected this $pages object yet. So I don't have access to it and it's going to give me an error. So here I'm just going to put an empty array, and then I'm actually going to get the data in this component by using a lifecycle hook called mounted to make sure that the data is ready for me when I'm asking for it. So here is where I can set this.events equal to the array of my actual events, which will be this.page.events.edges. And now I can filter off of this array. And I'm going to copy this real quick, because inside of my show all events method, I just want to show all events. So I'm going to set this.events back to all of the events in case it has been filtered by something else. And in the show events by type, this is actually where I'm going to do some filtering. And I have 3 tabs in this component. So tab 1 will be all events. Tab 2 is going to be music, or maybe live music. I guess it's live remote e-music. And then coding events. So it's going to be tab 0 for all events, tab 1 for music, and tab 2 for coding, which matches perfectly up with the categories in my API. So if I look through all of the events, I can see that this community music night event has an ID of 1, and then I can see IoT hack, which is a coding event, has an ID of 2. So coding is category ID 2 and music is category ID 1. So now I'm going to filter in here in the show events by type method. So I'm going to start this method by doing this dot events, which I will be setting to this dot $sign dot events dot edges, and then now I have to loop through these. So since it's an array, I can use the filter method from JavaScript, and I will get an event object there, or I'll call it edge to keep it consistent with what I've already written. And now basically I need to return true whenever the type of event matches what I'm filtering for. So to do that, I need to know which type of event, and instead of looking for this .tab, I'm already passing in the value here, so I might as well pass it through to show events by type, and then I will receive the value there. So I will return whenever edge.node.category is equal to the value that I have passed in, which for music events that will be a 1, and for coding events that will be a 2. As you can see, tab 1 and tab 2. Now to get this, I need to be pulling in that category attribute into my component. So I'm going to have to update this file to get category, and then I am also going to have to map the category, and I'm also going to have to make the category attribute available from my Gridsome server file. I basically need to add category onto these nodes, so category, and then in category I'm gonna just grab the ID from it, not the name or anything else. So event.categories, and then I'm just going to assume there's always one and only one category associated with an event, so I'll just grab the first one. So event.category0, and then grab the ID off of that. And now let me restart the server, and let me see if the filtering is indeed working. And it's not working, so let me try to figure out what's wrong. If I look first in the console, it doesn't look like there's any errors. So in the Vue.js DevTools, looking in the index file, I can see that the filtering actually worked. There's 2 items in the array right now. And when I go to coding, there's now 4 items, all events, there's 6 items. So filtering works, but the page isn't displaying the right thing. So if I come back to index, go up to the page, it's actually because I am looping through page.events.edges, which never filters. So I'm going to get rid of all of this and just loop through the events on data. Everything else should be the same. Now if I refresh my page, it is now filtering. Now I only have 2 events. I have 4 coding events, or I have all events. So filtering, watch all that stuff. It's the exact same methods that I would use in a regular Vue.js application. The only difference is how I receive the data in the component through that GraphQL data layer. Now there's one more quick thing that I want to fix here, and that is this date. So I'm going to stop my server and npm install moment, which is a JavaScript library that makes it really easy to format dates and has tons of helpful date methods. And now I will rerun the server, and I'm going to pull moment into this component. in my script tag, I can import moment from moment. And now I'm going to create a special method or a custom method here for formatting the date. So I'm going to call it format date, pass in a date to format, and then I will return moment, pass in the date to moment, and then moment has this method called format. I'm going to format, and this is all in the moment documentation, all the different ways that you can display a date. This is just how I'm choosing to display it with the month, day, year, hours, minutes, and then because I live in America, I'm going to do AM or PM. And now the only thing I have to do is take this format date function, come to my date, and then pass in the date to the format function, and that should return a properly formatted date, which you can see now, August 9th, 2020, etc. Now, how would I click on one of these cards and go to a page specifically for that event? So I mentioned templates earlier, and that's what we're actually going to use for this. So in source, there's a templates directory, and I'm going to create a new file called event.vue. And now in this file, it's just a regular Vue file, so I'm going to add the template tag, and I'm going to pass this into layout, which is my default layout that I'm using everywhere else. And then inside of that, I'm going to do an h1 tag, and that's going to have my event title inside. So let me close the layout. And now I'm going to need to get the data inside of this component for a specific event. So I need to use another page query here to make a GraphQL query. And how do I get the data for just one specific event? So I'm going to come into my GraphQL playground and just write the query here first. So I'm going to do query and then the curly braces, and then I need to let it know what I'm going to query. So I can actually tell it what type I want to query because I just want one item. I don't want an array of items. So I can say event, and then I need to pass in the ID of a specific event. So I'm going to say ID is 5. And now what items do I want to get back from that one specific event? And I'm going to say I want the ID and the title, duration, that's fine. And now if I click the run button, I see I get back all of that information. I don't need to do edges and node because it just finds one particular node based off of the query because I'm just looking for one, and then just returns that to me. So it's a little bit simpler, and I'm going to copy this, come back to my event.vue, paste it in. I'm going to add a few more things on here too, like price, date, and image. And then at the bottom here, I am going to add a script tag really quick. And this is basically because I want to set the page title for each event page to be dynamic based off the name of the event. So I can do this through Gridsome's meta info object or method, and I can return title this dot page dot event dot title, and this will set the page title to be this title variable. Okay, now I've created a special template for this event. One thing I want to do really quickly is just display something on the page so I can make sure it's working. So page.event.title. And now how do I get to this page? So let me go to the Gridsome server.js file. And I forgot to start recording, but this path is basically what I need to add. So I'll explain that in a second, but that's why it's already typed in there. So here I need to tell it for this collection, for each type event in GraphQL, I can give it a path of where that event page will be. And since there are many events, it needs to be a dynamic path name. So I'm going to say /events and then ID, so the ID of the event. And each event will be displayed at that page with its own ID in the URL. And now you can see that I have added path here. On each node that I'm adding in the collection, I'm giving it its own path with its individual ID. So now when a user hits this path, this page will load and show the title of the event. So let me restart the server to see that working. And in the app, I'm going to go to /events and then an ID of any one of the events. So I'll do 5. Works. And you can see that it shows the title of the IoT hack, which is the name of the event. So there's a couple more things that I want to do with just formatting the event pages. And one of them is actually in this layout template. So in my pages, actually I don't need the about page anymore, so let me delete that. That was just there by default. So in this index page, I have container, row, and column to put everything in the middle of the page, but I'm going to be using this on a lot of pages. So I'm actually going to copy this and go to my layouts, default, and now around this slot, I'm going to add the container, row, column, and let me close that. And now I don't need to have these things on specific pages. So let me go to the index page and get rid of those extra elements now, because now they're part of the layout. So let me get all of these. Okay, so I'll only be using the nested rows. Get rid of those 3. And now this is set apart from the edge in the top a little bit more. I also want to display the image for the event. So I can display an image tag. Use source equals, then use graves inside. So this will just be the URL of the image. So be localhost, these are on my server, so localhost 1337. And then I will pass in the path of the particular image that I want to display, which will be page.event.image. And that should display the image, and then I will just display the description below this. So I'll do page.event.description. Then I have to close the image. And there it displays okay. I think that actually this particular event might not have a description. Let me check. Oh, right, I can't click on these yet. So let me actually make these clickable first, and then I'll check. So if I go to my index page, I'm going to add an @click on the button here to capture a click event. And then I'm going to use the router methods that I have available from Vue router in Gridsome. So I have router.push, and then I can do /events, and then I need to pass in the ID of the event in the loop. So I'll need to pass in edge.node.id. Let me see if this works. Hackathon. Okay, so it displays the hackathon. Let me go to another one. Jazz Jam. So it looks like the description just isn't showing up. So let me go to events, and that's right, I'm not importing description. So let me now query for description, make sure that's spelled correctly, it is. And now if I go, it shows the description at the bottom. And now there's no way to get back from one of these pages. So I am actually going to add a link to this events title in the corner here. and that is found in my default layout component. I have this toolbar title. Let me put that on a new line, and I'm going to wrap that in a link. So like I mentioned before, Gridsome has its own link component that's kind of like Vue Router's link component, where you do you set this to prop and it will route inside your application. So I'm going to say to and then just / to route to the home page. And now I can click on it, route to the home page. Real quick, I'm going to fix the styling on this link. Just come to the bottom here, make a style tag, and I can reference the toolbar with _ and title. And then I want to reference the anchor tag inside of that. Basically get rid of the underline, so text decoration is none. And then I also want to set the color back to black. And that looks much more like a regular title. So if I come into an event, I can go back by clicking on the title in the nav bar. So now I'm going to hook up the search bar. If this were an application that I was going to deploy somewhere, I would use a library like JS Search or Flex Search, or even an API solution to make API calls to query for the data that I'm searching for. But for this, I'm going to do it the easiest way possible, and that's by basically filtering by the name or the title of the event. To do that, I need to add a vModel so I can capture what I'm typing into my search here. So I'm going to do vModel, and I'll just call this search text. And now if I scroll down, I need to create a script tag to model this. So script, and then the data method, return an object, and I'll put search text is an empty string by default. And now this is in my default layout component, and I need to get it into this index.view component. And so there are several different ways of data handling and management in Vue.js. You can pass things around component to component, use events that are built into Vue. And since I'm not using Vuex for state management in this application, I think the best option would be to pass it directly from default.view to index.view. And I can do that actually passing data through the slot. So I'm going to come up here, and this slot is where all the pages are displayed. So I can actually pass props into the slot that the pages can see. And that's what I'm going to do with search text. I'm going to vbind my search text equals search text variable. And now from my index.view component, I can receive that using the vslot directive. So I can do vslot equals props here, but instead of using props just as an object of all of the props, I'm actually going to just pull out search text from props. And now I can use search text anywhere in this component, but I want to be able to call a method to filter using search text. So I'm going to come down here actually to events. So I'm looping through events, so I'm going to have to update events to consider anything that might be in search text. So I'm going to create a getter events method. So I'm going to say get events, and then I'm going to pass in the search text. And so get events is going to return all events, and if there's search text, then it's going to filter the events based off of the search text. So let me create a method for this in my methods after format date. I'm going to say get events, pass in search text, and then I need to return an array because I am looping through this still. So I need to return this dot events dot filter, and then just like this other filter up here, I'll keep the same syntax, so I'll say edge and make it an arrow function. And now this function I'm passing into filter needs to return true or false based off of whether or not I'm going to keep each object in the final array that I output. So I'm going to return edge.node, and then I'm filtering or searching by title. So I'm just going to consider title. And then 2 lowercase, because I don't want this to be a case sensitive search. And then I can use the JavaScript includes method for strings. Basically, I can find out if this string, edge.node.title, includes any of the text that I'm going to pass in. So I will call that with search text, and then with search text 2, I'm going to have to lowercase that as well. And that should filter by the search text. So let me see if that works. And let me just start typing in. That's awesome. It works perfectly. And based off of what tab I am in, it's just filtering by the current array of events, so nothing else. Because it's just a getter method, it's not mutating the state of the component, so I can update the search text and it has no effect on the actual array that I am displaying on the page if I get rid of the text. One more thing that I really should have with search text is it should be clearable. And I can add that with a clearable prop here. So in my vText field, I'm going to add a clearable prop. And now if I type something in here, you can see an X appears. The only problem is when the X clears the search box, the page doesn't update until I start typing again. So one way I can fix this is if I look in the text fields documentation here for Vuetify, I can look in the API for vText field and go to events, and I can see all of the events that I have available to me. So I'm going to take this event, which is a clear event. So when they click the clear button, basically, this event is emitted. So I'm going to put that event right here at click dot or colon clear. And then I can run some piece of JavaScript whenever this event occurs. And what I'm going to do here, just to make it simple, is manually set the search text equal to an empty string again. And that is going to trigger an update from the function so that it will refilter the array. So let me try that out. I'll do hackathon and now clear, and now all of my events come back. So what about the create event page? Like it implies, it would be a form page where you could fill out information and create a new event. If you look in the Gridsome docs, it recommends some form submission services. And basically, we could do the same thing posting to our backend, which is Strapi. Like it shows here, we could have a handle submit method in our Vue.js and then just make a fetch request which is posted to Strapi. Or if I had something like a contact form, I would probably use one of these options like FormSpree. But as far as hooking up this post request and deploying this application, you are going to have to check out my channel. I will be posting some videos on deploying applications, and I'm going to be deploying several of the applications that I have built on my channel over the last few months. So if you want to see more Gridsome, more Vue.js, and more other related coding topics, then make sure you check out my channel, Faraday Academy.